Hello, this is the lecture from Monday, week 6. First of all is the agency presentations are due on Sunday, and you should have already seen that I posted here the groups for these federal agency presentations for each of the classes. So if you're in the 9 o'clock, here you are, or 10 o'clock here. So you can see here the agency that you're covering, the chapter in the text, and then you'll also, and all of your group members, you'll also want to refer to the corresponding article for your agency. So if you're doing the BLM, here's yours, or Army Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Reclamation, these two here. Let me see. Okay, then we are going to take a look at this presentation. And within this presentation, there is a video that you need to watch. And let's see. So I'm going to dive into this, and this is where you find the link to Federal Lands Explained. It's a short video, not even 8 minutes, but it's excellent. So, federal natural resource management agencies were born out of the conservation and preservation philosophies of the 19th century that we talked about in chapter 4. There were, in addition to the agencies that you all are covering for the presentations, also some other agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency. Dennis doesn't talk about the EPA very much in his chapter, but there are a little bit of information that I'll talk about in a little bit. Okay. So if you look at chapter 5 in your textbook, which I asked you to read for this week, you see this table, 5.1, which is a breakdown of a lot of different federal agencies that are relevant to our class, including the Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, Bureau of Reclamation, and Army Corps of Engineers. Now, we don't really talk too much about the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but I'll get into that in just a moment. This is a map that covers the Bureau of Indian Affairs jurisdiction areas, and it's nice to kind of see how they've broken up the country in their management areas. We don't cover this that much in this class. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs operates only on Native American land. So obviously they're not covering this, and they're only covering native lands within each of these areas. Some of the other agencies that are important to mention are the Department of Defense, of which the Army Corps of Engineers is a part. That agency was actually formed during the Revolutionary War. It's been around that long. But the Department of Defense includes in its management lands like military bases, bombing ranges, all kinds of lands that are associated with the military. And then the Department of Energy has lands also that it manages, like nuclear reactors, research labs, nuclear waste cleanup areas, nuclear waste storage facilities, all of those kinds of resources. So that department manages those kinds of lands. We also don't talk too much about the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, but it's important because it manages a lot of marine sanctuaries and coastal reserves and estuary reserves. Here's where we get into regulators like the EPA. So the EPA was established in 1970 under President Nixon. And these are hyperlinks to just kind of see some of the issues that were going on before we had agencies like the EPA, like rivers on fire because of pollution. And I want to note that President Nixon was a Republican, but this was a bipartisan effort to create the Environmental Protection Agency. So if you ever thought, and I wouldn't blame you if you did, that Republicans and Democrats have never worked together, this is an example where that happened. And we actually have President Nixon's administration to thank, in part, with a lot of other people, for not just the EPA, but also Congress for passing the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act and other legislation that I've talked about that are still important today. Now, so before we had the Environmental Protection Agency, there were 44 different agencies. Imagine that were trying to deal with environmental issues around the country. So putting everything under one agency really organized things. It also created the ability for the federal government to establish standards that would apply across the country. And that's a really important thing for public health. Now, if you ever thought that the EPA will always be around, I just want to alert you to this House bill, which was proposed in 2017 by Representative Matt Gaetz of Florida to terminate the Environmental Protection Agency. If this had passed, it didn't really get much traction, but if it had passed, the Environmental Protection Agency would have been terminated in 2018. Can you imagine not having an Environmental Protection Agency? Also, the other important thing to mention here is this Local Enforcement for Local Lands Act. So there is a sentiment around the country that agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency should cede their power to the local levels, and that resources should be managed at the local level. While I believe that it is very important and critical that federal agencies, all of these agencies that we are studying in this class, should be paying attention to what local people have to say about how to manage the resources that they use, that we still need those resources managed and protected from a federal level so that standards are applied across the board, but that they should be adjusted for local areas. But you'll see in the video, Federal Lands Explained, that there are people that absolutely disagree with that, with what I just said. Okay, the other thing I want to mention on this slide is the Council on Environmental Quality. So this was established when the National Environmental Policy Act was passed, and it was set up to interpret NEPA. It is composed of 3 members that are appointed by the president, so you can imagine that with each new administration, the flavor of the Council on Environmental Quality changes. But I also want to say that the CEQ, its guidelines have repeatedly been upheld by the Supreme Court. And I also want to mention that the National Environmental Policy Act, we can't always depend that it will be around, because there are plenty of people in Congress that would like to chip away at the protections that the National Environmental Policy Act affords all of us. We haven't really gotten into talking that much about the National Environmental Policy Act, but we will in the second half of the course. And then there are congressional committees and subcommittees, and you can see this in Chapter 5. In this table, there are, you'll see committees for the House and committees for the Senate. They're very similar. They're not exactly the same, but they're very similar. And of course, those are just the committees that are relevant to our class. There are more committees than that, but and they are the committees that take pieces of legislation and work through the details. So anytime a piece of legislation is proposed in Congress, it will go to a committee or to a subcommittee for budgeting and for working out the nuts and bolts of that legislation as it works through the process to become a law. So if we look at this, let me bring this over. If we look at this PowerPoint, how a bill gets through Congress, this is just a refresher on that. I had asked you to watch the Schoolhouse Rock videos to refresh yourself on the 3 branches of government and how a bill becomes law. We're not going to go through all of this, but I have it here. And this is the flow chart. What happens in the Senate is very similar to what happens in the House, just slightly different. And then these are those committees that I was talking about. These are committees for the Senate and committees for the House. The last thing that I want to mention in this presentation is the executive branch. So I just was talking about the legislative branch, which is Congress. The executive branch is made up of the president and the cabinet. The president is responsible for enforcing the laws that are passed by Congress, and appoints heads of federal agencies, including the cabinet, but also including all of the departments, like the Department of Interior, for example. In the earlier table I showed you of the different agencies, you can see what department the National Park Service is in, and the Bureau of Land Management. For example, those 2 agencies are in the Interior Department, but you'll notice that the Forest Service is in the Department of Agriculture. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, because the Forest Service was born out of the conservation philosophy of resource use and extraction, and viewing forests as timber, as a commodity, as an agricultural commodity. So that's why the Forest Service is actually located in the Department of Agriculture, sorry. And each of those different departments that house the agencies, these federal agencies that we're studying, they have their own culture that is imbued into all of the agencies within those departments. What is not here is the last branch of government, which is the judicial branch. And this includes the Supreme Court. The judicial branch also includes many other layers of courts in our country, which Dennis does talk about. Okay, we will exit out of here, and the next thing I want to show you is this article here. What are public lands and who manages them? This is an excellent article, not very long, but if you are unfamiliar with these agencies, well, I want everyone to read this article. And there are a few things that I'll mention about it. So right here, this graphic, you can see that of the land that the 640 million acres of federally managed land in our country, the BLM is the largest land manager, followed by the Forest Service, and then these two agencies. And then if we scroll down, you can see the different kinds of uses that happen on these federal lands. And each land will have its own specific regulations about what's allowed and not allowed. But for example, you will not see timber harvesting on national park land. And of course that makes sense because the National Park Service was born out of the preservation philosophy, and those values have been imbued in that agency since its beginning. So you'll find that certain uses are disallowed in some areas. And if you can read about each of these agencies. And then I want to talk about this, land designations. This is important, and it's nice to have it all in one place. So wilderness is the most restrictive land designation. Wilderness is a specific land designation that came out of the Wilderness Act passed in 1964. So we saw last week the short video about the Wilderness Act. The Wilderness Act also set up the National Wilderness Preservation System right here. So wilderness restricts what can happen on lands that are managed. These are the 4 agencies that manage wilderness: the Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, Forest Service, and Fish and Wildlife Service. The other agencies do not manage wilderness. So, can you ride your bike in a wilderness area? No, bike riding is not allowed in wilderness areas. There are other uses that are restricted as well. Let's see. Wilderness Study Area is the next designation I want to talk about. So, wilderness study areas are often, that designation is often a gateway for a piece of land to eventually become a wilderness area. But there are plenty of wilderness study areas that will never become wilderness. This is not as restrictive, but it does require that agencies look at these lands for their potential to become wilderness areas. And wilderness areas have to be, I should have mentioned, they have to be approved by Congress. Wilderness study areas do not. Same with national parks. National parks have to be approved by Congress also, and this is the highest level of protection for lands that are managed by the Park Service. But the Park Service also manages national monuments, as do these agencies. So if you think about these 4 agencies, they manage wilderness, they manage national monuments, and national monuments are often the gateway for a land to become a national park. So if you think back to the video we watched about the President Roosevelt using the Antiquities Act to protect the Grand Canyon as a national monument, that was one step in the process for it to become a national park, which it is today. Then there are national conservation areas. These are only these lands are managed only by the BLM. National recreation areas. But I want to talk about wild and scenic rivers for a second, because wild and scenic rivers is the highest level of protection for rivers. So these would be free-flowing rivers with no dams. And of course, with these protections comes some federal funding. It's not always terribly reliable, but it is there, and restrictions about what can happen in those areas. Okay, so take a look at that article. And then this is a short slideshow that I put together of some of my favorite federal lands, public lands that I have visited, and almost loading. Okay, so this first one here is Three Rivers Petroglyph Park in central New Mexico. So petroglyphs are images that are chiseled into stone by indigenous peoples from long ago. And this particular park has these boulders all around with many, many petroglyphs. And the story I told in class about this is that I visited this park one time, back in the early 90s. And while I was strolling through and looking at these, and by the way, this is managed by the BLM, this man came up to me and asked me, pointed at one of the images and said, "Do you know what that is?" And he was very ornery, let's say that. And I looked at him dumbly. I didn't know what he was talking about. He was basically saying, well, so I said no. And he said, "It's a map." And he might as well have said, "It's a map, dummy," the way he was talking to me. And I had to agree. I looked at the image, and I don't have a picture of that one, but when I looked at the stone, it was actually showing these mountains with the snowpack in this one area. So it's fascinating. It really opened my eyes to really looking at these images nested within a larger context. So I wanted to kind of look from a new perspective on each of these images and how did it relate to the landscape. The conversation went downhill from there because it then turned into something about Hillary Clinton and Spanish gold. So at that point I excused myself and finished strolling, but amazing place. This is Carlsbad Caverns National Park, which is in southeastern New Mexico. Very dry area, but this is the entry and exit for an enormous population of bats. The bats will leave at dusk to go out and hunt insects, and they come back in the morning before sunrise and roost during the day because, of course, they're nocturnal. This is also the entry and exit for people. So there's this pathway that goes actually down in switchbacks, and it's paved and it's very walkable. There are sidewalks and elevators and lights inside this cavern. It's enormous and has many different rooms. So when I mentioned that in class, some people were kind of surprised that there would be all of that development inside. But this is what you get to see because of that. You can see here there's a little handrail, but these incredible stalagmites and stalactites. One of the management issues when we visited this park that they told us about is the fact that the moisture that has been feeding and growing these stalactites and stalagmites over millennia has been reduced because of the parking lots up on the surface. So parking lots are impermeable surfaces that don't allow water to flow through and continue to develop these. So, of course, when I visited this, my kids were very little. It's been a long time. So I don't know if the Park Service has been working on retrofitting their parking lots at Carlsbad or not. But this is not an easy park to get to. You have to really, really want to go there. But it is extraordinary. This is just a garden variety, stunning view of the Wilson Creek area in the Pisgah. It could be anywhere in our beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains. We are so very lucky to have places like this so nearby. This is another site in New Mexico. This one is in Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge. So this is managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So the Rio Grande originates in Colorado and goes through New Mexico down into into Texas and then Mexico. Because it cuts through such an arid environment, it is a very important flyway for many species of birds that are migrating between Canada and Mexico or even Central America. And so you can see that there are so many birds. The best way to visit this place is to go before sunrise so that you can watch the birds as they rise in the morning. And this area has many different wetlands, and the Fish and Wildlife Service manages those areas for these birds that are part of this flyway. So in the morning before the sun rises, you can hear all kinds of noises from all of these different wetlands. And then all at once, birds from one wetland will rise like this, a mass ascension. And then another wetland will do the same, and another, and until they all leave to go look for food during the day. And then they come back, similar to the bats, they come back at night and roost together in these wetlands, safety in numbers. Of course, there's still a lot of predators out there, but they're safer if they're all together. There are a lot of grain fields that are planted to help keep some food available to these birds on their treks. This, if you thought that these public lands were only in the West or maybe just around here, this one is Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore in Michigan. So this is Lake Michigan here. These dunes are enormous. You can actually see more dunes down the coast there. This is about a 500-foot drop, and you actually can walk all the way to the bottom, but the signs that the Park Service has put up here say, please don't, because it could take you 2 hours to walk back up. Look at this poor guy, right? Hands and knees. If you've ever walked on sand, you know how exhausting it can be. And these are serious dunes. But one can't blame these people because look how inviting the water is at the bottom. But there are easier ways to get to the water than climbing down a sand dune. Amazing place. This is Beastie Badlands. This is in northwestern New Mexico. There are not, you can see it's very dry, but what incredible minerals that you can see in the rock. Also, many dinosaur fossils in this area. This is Cochiti Dam. This is just outside of Santa Fe, and this is the Rio Grande here, north of Albuquerque and south of Santa Fe. So just want to point out, you can see the green bosque area, which is like an area, a forested area along a river, Spanish word, and lots of farming in this area. Very dry outside of here, but this reservoir here is called Cochiti Reservoir because it's right near Cochiti Pueblo, which is right here. So this is a recreation area and water storage area for Albuquerque. The Army Corps of Engineers manages this area. This is Shasta National Forest in California, but it could be many other places. So that is it for that slideshow of public lands. There are many more, of course. And you should definitely take a look at those. Let's see. And then I have a map of federal lands here that I'd like to show you. So you can spend a little time looking at this. And here is, if we scroll down, we can see the legend here. The most important things I want to point out are the dark green, which is the Forest Service, light green is the Park Service, and the yellow, which is the BLM. So as I mentioned before, the BLM is the largest land manager in our country, so you can certainly see that in this graphic. But I also want to show you, along the Blue Ridge Mountains, there are a lot of national forests, and there's also Great Smokies National Park. That's not Great. Yeah, that's Great Smokies, and then up in the Shenandoah Valley, we have the Shenandoah Valley National Park. If we take a look at federal lands in North Carolina, we can see that we can see a breakdown here. Here's the National Park, Great Smokies, and then here's the Nantahala National Forest, our neighborhood national forest, the Pisgah, which is adjacent to Blowing Rock. So it's really right in our neighborhood. So I hope you all will enjoy that while you're students, at least. Here is the Uwharrie National Forest in central North Carolina, and then the Croatan on the coast. These orange areas are national wildlife refuges. So you can see there's a number of them in the eastern part of the state. And then you can see some military areas as well. Okay, the last thing that I want to mention is